Okay, so morning everyone and welcome to the Discovering Reptiles, Reptile Identification, Ecology and Survey Methods workshop. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Froglife. We are a national wildlife conservation charity and we have a particular focus on amphibians and reptiles. And we do this in three different ways, primarily. And those are practical habitat management, educational workshops and training, like the workshop this morning that I'm running, and research as well. So you may have seen a little bit of our research on toads and how they use roads, and we're also conducting some research into adders at the moment as well. And this project, the Discovering Reptiles project, is a 2-year funded project by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And what we really want to do is we want to give people a little bit more knowledge on reptiles and particularly encourage them to get out to their local green spaces and record those reptiles. And as part of that, we really want you to send us the data. So when we get the data, we can do some really good things with it. We will be able to better target where we do the habitat management, and we will better target our research as well. So that's kind of what all this project is about, learning about reptiles and going out and surveying for them and then making sure you give us all that data so we can do some good things with it. Okay, so what is the course going to involve today? It's split up into 3 rough parts. So the first chunk of the workshop, we're going to focus on what UK reptiles you actually find here. So that's going to include natives and non-natives. The threats that those reptiles undergo, as well a little bit about the conservation of some of those reptiles, not all of them. We'll have a few identification exercises as well. We'll have a break and then we'll move on to sort of reptile ecology and their UK distribution. And we'll then end the workshop looking at different survey methods that you can employ and how to use the Froglife Dragon Finder app. So the Dragon Finder app is a nifty little thing that you can help to identify reptiles and then record your sightings, and then we get that data, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Okay, so before we begin, I'm gonna take a snapshot into all of your minds as to what your reptile knowledge is currently like. And then I ask you to do the same quiz again at the end. And that really helps us gauge whether this workshop is doing what it's supposed to do. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to improve your knowledge of reptiles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a link into the chat. And that will take you to an ID quiz. And they are all UK reptiles. Some are native, some aren't. But just try your best. It is quite difficult. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. I'm going to give everybody the option to unmute themselves if they want to. If they're having trouble with this link or something, just let me know. But just give it your best shot. And then we'll move on with the workshop in about 5 minutes. Okay, so we're going to start with Reptile ID. So for anyone that felt they didn't do particularly well in the ID quiz, this is the part you want to pay attention to. And I don't imagine many people did. It's a very hard quiz. There's some ones in there that you just probably have never heard of before. But we're going to start with the common or widespread species. And these are the ones you're most likely to see when you're just out and about. You're not specifically looking for reptiles, and you might just happen to come across them. And we've got a couple of lizard species and a single snake species. So we're going to start with the common or viviparous lizard. Now their average length is around 13 to 15 centimeters, And you can see across all of these pictures that their coloration is really varied. So they can be anywhere from sort of yellowy or dull green to brown, or almost a sort of bronzy colour. Now you sometimes do get melanistic or black individuals. This image in the top right here is actually a juvenile. They're born almost black. That isn't a melanistic lizard, that's just a juvenile. Now the males and females are quite difficult to tell apart, but there are a couple of things you can look for. Sometimes they're very subtle, so you won't be able to tell. But if you take a look at a stripe down the very centre of the lizard, in some individuals it's going to be almost solid. It's not going to be very broken up at all. If we look at this one here in the bottom, you can see it's a little bit more broken up. There's a few more spots surrounding it, and that's particularly true of this image in the top left here. It's the females that have this solid line that run down the back. It's called a dorsolateral stripe. And the males, it's a little bit more broken up and a little bit more spotty. And as well as that, the males have larger heads than the females, although this can be really difficult to notice if you don't have a side-by-side comparison. But what you sometimes can see is in the males, this bulge at the base of the tail. And that's particularly prominent during the breeding season, which is around March to April. Now they can be mistaken for newts. They superficially do resemble newts. And some of you may have noticed this image here in the bottom left is actually a newt. So how can you tell the difference? Now I think the best way is just to approach whatever you've seen, and if it scuttles off very quickly without giving you any opportunity to catch it, it's almost definitely a lizard. Newts, when they're out of the water, are very slow, they're very sluggish, and they're very, very easy to pick up. They're not going to escape very rapidly. But you can see as well that on the lizards, they have individual scales. You can see that scaly skin quite clearly. Now, when newts are out of land, if they're dry, their skin is quite velvety, but you can't see any scales. Their skin will look a bit wet and smooth and shiny when they've just come out of water, but you will never see any scales on newts. And if you do get close enough, you can count the front toes. If you can count 4 front toes, it's a newt. And if you look at the images of the lizards here, they actually have 5 front toes. It's going to be hard to get up to a lizard that close without it scuttling off to be able to count its toes. But that's one method of telling the difference. Okay, so our second widespread and common lizard species. And one of everyone's favourite facts is that this is actually a legless lizard. It does look a little bit like a snake. Now the slow worm is around 35 to 40 centimetres. They can grow up to around 50 centimetres, so they're a lot bigger than our common lizards. And the best feature you kind of want to be looking out for to give you a positive ID is this smooth, glossy skin. So they do have scales, but those scales are smooth and glossy. It gives it a very shiny looking appearance. You can see there's very little distinction between the head and the body. So where the neck is, you can't really tell where the neck meets the body. And when we look at a few of our snake species, you'll be able to see the difference. It's very obvious usually where their head meets their body. And the coloration again is quite varied, but it's a little bit more distinctive between the sexes. So in this bottom image here, we have a male, and they tend to be a little bit more brown or grey. But as they get older, they sometimes develop this blue flecking down the body. Now it's really prominent here in this individual, but it can be quite subtle sometimes. But that's what you kind of want to be looking out for to give you an idea of whether it's male or female. The females, by contrast, they're sort of more golden, bronzy, but they do have these dark flanks. So the flanks are usually quite a bit darker than the coloration on top. And you do see these very broken sort of vertical lines, darker lines running the length of the body. They almost look like dots that it's so broken. You do get that on the females. The juveniles are probably more similar in appearance to the females. They have almost black flanks, and they're a lot lighter bronze or golden, and they're very, very small and very thin. They're only about 4 centimeters on birth. So like I said, they can be confused with snakes. You're looking for this smooth, glossy skin. But if you do get to look at them for long enough and you see it blink, it's definitely a slow worm. Lizards have eyelids, whereas snakes do not. So if you see it blink and you can't tell whether it's a snake or a slow worm, it's definitely a slow worm. Okay, moving on to the snake species that you may find out and about, and that is the barred grass snake. Now, the barred grass snake is usually a green or dark olivey colour. And the positive ID feature that you're looking for is this yellow collar behind the back of the head. You can see it on all 3 individuals in this image. It can differ in size and how prominent it is, but it is almost always there. And a secondary feature, these dark bars running the length of the flanks as well. You can see it really clearly here in the bottom image. You've got these dark bars running the length of the flanks, and that actually gives it its name, the barred grass snake. These also can be quite difficult to sex. So the females tend to be a bit bigger. So the average grass snake in adulthood is around 60 to 100 centimeters. So they're a whopping big species. They are very big. When you see a big adult, most people are taken back the first time they see that. And the females can grow up to 1.5 meters. And when you're trying to sex these, you kind of want to look at one end or the other. So females have very short, stubby tails. Now it can be difficult to tell where the body ends and the tail starts, unless you flip the snake over and you identify where the vent is. But most people don't want to go into that much technical detail. But you can see here on this individual, and this is a female here in the top left, that the sort of body tapers off very quickly. It gets very skinny, almost, well, just rapidly. So that's probably the tail here. It probably starts here. You've got this very chunky body, very skinny tail. And that's the females that have that feature. We've got a male here in the top right image, and you can see it's a much more gradual sort of decline into the tail. It looks much more natural. It's very, very difficult to see where the tail begins on a male. And then if you look at the head on a female, you can see it's it attaches to the body in a much more prominent fashion. So there's a much bigger distinction between the head and the body. It almost looks like the head's bigger because it attaches and it goes out quite a bit. And on the male here, it looks like it has a much skinnier head and there's a much more gradual attachment to the body. This is probably a male down here as well, but it's difficult to tell from this angle. The juveniles are really similar in appearance. They're just like little versions of the adults, but they're around 20 centimeters long. They always have that yellow collar that I was talking about. Now, the other snake species you may confuse the barred grass snake with is the adder. We'll get onto some of the key features of the adder next. But whilst we're on grass snakes, just take a look at the eye. You can see that the eye is, the barred grass snake has circular pupils with this yellow iris. Whereas adders, and we'll see this, they have a vertical pupil with a red iris. Very striking looking eye in the adder. So we're going to move on to the less common and rare species. Although one of these is what I would consider widespread, and that's the adder. So you still might come across the adder if you're out and about, but they are definitely less common than the barred grass snake. So the adults are around 60 to 80 centimeters, and they're a very stocky looking snake. They're very thick set in their build. They're much wider than the other snake species that you find in this country. And they almost invariably have this zigzag pattern running down the length of the body on top. So you can see that in all three of these pictures, they've got this zigzag pattern. And it could look a little bit different from individual to individual, but you can almost always see it. Now the males tend to be this dull grey colour, and they always have a black zigzag pattern. Whereas the females tend to be more brown, and then they have a darker zigzag pattern on their back. This can sometimes be black as well. So if you see an individual with a brown zigzag pattern, it's either a female or a juvenile. This is a juvenile that we've got here in the top left. So they're a bit more gingery than the females, but you can still see that sort of gingery zigzag pattern. If you see a black snake, a melanistic snake, it's almost definitely an adder in this country. It's very rare to get melanistic individuals of barred grass snakes. So these are our only venomous snakes. They're not particularly dangerous because they're very, very shy. But if you do see a black snake, don't make any attempts to grab it, because it will probably be an adder. And that's why I say you almost always see a black zigzag pattern, because if it is a melanistic individual, you probably won't see it, because it will just blend in to the coloration of the body. And just take a look at this eye as well. So this eye with the red iris and that black vertical pupil, very different to the barred grass snake, and very fitting for a snake that is venomous. It almost looks at you and says, don't disturb me. You really don't want to be picking me up, because I will probably try and bite you. Okay, so moving on to probably some of the rarest UK native reptiles. And we'll begin with the sand lizards. So we've got two images of sand lizards here in the top left and in the centre. Now these are a bit bigger than our common lizards, so they can grow up to 20 centimetres. And they have this really short, stocky head. Both the males and the females have a much thicker built head than the common lizards. And the coloration, again, can be varied. The best ID feature you're looking for are these cream eye spots running down the dorsolateral stripe and on either side. So they'll have three lines. You can see one here down the middle, and then a line here, and then a line here. And these eye spots are usually, the centre's very light and creamy, and then the outside is sort of a bit darker. And that usually gives it away as a sand lizard. Now the males develop this bright green flank on both sides during the breeding season. And you just don't get that sort of bright green in common lizards. And when they are a sort of duller green, it's usually across the entire body. It's not just the flanks. And the reason the sand lizards actually develop green flanks like this is to protect themselves. Well, it's for courtship, but the reason they don't develop it on top is to sort of defend themselves from aerial predators. So if something like a kestrel is out hunting, it's only going to see the top of the sand lizard, and that's going to blend in beautifully to the sand and the dry grass that it tends to favour. And you'll only really find sand lizards in lowland heathland in the south of England. And due to some good conservation efforts as well, you also get them on the sort of western UK sand dunes. So Merseyside is a good spot for them, and have been reintroduced into places like Wales. You tend not to find these unless you know where they already are. There tends to be really good conservation efforts around these guys, so you unlikely find them by random. And this is probably more so the next species, the smooth snake. So the smooth snake is probably, one of the rarest UK terrestrial natives. And they're about the same size as the adder, around 50 to 70 centimetres, but they have a much slender body. You see this image in the top right here, a lot less thick set than the adder. And they're usually this grey or brown colour, a little bit nondescript. And you'll sometimes see these two rows of dark spots So if you can see this here, we've got a row beginning there and a row beginning here, running down the length of the body. That can sometimes be very subtle, sometimes it can be absent. And you'll also sometimes see this heart-shaped crest on top of the head. So here's the top of the heart there. But that's, again, it's not on all individuals. The main thing I would look for is this eye stripe. So the image is cut off a little bit here, but you can see this dark stripe that runs through the eye. This is characteristic of quite a few snakes. But for our native reptiles, this is the only one that has it. It has that eye stripe. It's probably a smooth snake. There's a non-native that may have an eye stripe as well, but I'll show you the differences between those later. Now, these are pretty much only found in areas of very mature heathland in the south. I think they're only found across 3 counties in south of England. They're very rare and they are very protected. And then finally, and this is something a lot of people either don't realise or forget, I'm always forgetting, that leatherback turtle is considered one of our native reptiles. So they are a marine turtle, and they are the world's largest turtle, 4th largest reptile. So they can be up to 2 meters in length, which is huge. They can weigh up to 600 kilograms, which is very, very weighty. I think they're only outranked in terms of size in the reptile world by various species of crocodile. So they are considered native because they do come to UK waters deliberately to feed on jellyfish. We do get other marine turtles in the UK, but they are considered vagrant. They're usually ill or dying, and they've just washed up into our sort of more shallow waters. And it's worth noting that the leatherback turtles, they do not come ashore on the UK. It is only the females that come to shore to lay their eggs, and they only lay their eggs in the tropical and subtropical regions. But you can see these, particularly in the west coast. You can get a few boat tours that go out just to sort of try and find feeding leatherback turtles. Okay, so those are our sort of six or seven native reptile species. We've also got a similar amount of non-native or introduced species as well. A couple of lizards, a couple of snakes, and a couple of turtles, or terrapins, as they're fondly known. So we'll start with the lizards. And it's worth noting for the lizards, they're not strictly non-native to the UK, as they are found in the Channel Islands. So you may get them in Jersey or Guernsey. They are considered native there, but they have been introduced to southern England, and that's where they're considered non-native or introduced. So the wall lizards, these top 2 images here, both wall lizard, and they're a bit bigger than our common lizard, again at around 20 centimeters. But their tail is much longer. The tail is around 2/3 the length of their body. So you can see this individual here in the top right. If the tail starts about there, goes all the way off the screen, and then back up onto the screen and off the screen again. They have very long tails. They also have quite long limbs in comparison as well. You can see this one's propping itself up with its long legs. And it's got these long, spindly, feathery toes as well. Common lizards have very short, stumpy toes. But you can see the coloration is a little bit different to the common lizard. Particularly in this individual up here, it's this bright sort of green with these black dots all over. But they are varied. The best way to tell the difference is look for that long tail, that long neck and long head, long limbs and long toes. They're a long-looking lizard. They do like sort of rocky environments. So if you see something, vertical on a wall, and you're in the sort of South English region around Bournemouth or Southampton, good chance it's a wall lizard. Common lizards, they like to stay horizontal. They don't like to be vertical. And then in the bottom image here, we've got the green lizard, striking looking lizard. It looks tropical. It looks like you should get this somewhere far sunnier than here in the UK. And they do actually struggle here because they do prefer warmer environments. So they don't persist in our environment particularly well. But they are found, I think, probably in areas around Southampton. That's where they've been released. And they grow quite big, the biggest of any UK lizard, non-native and native. Well, other than a slow worm. Okay, lizard with legs, around 35 centimetres. And they just have this green coloration throughout. The males will develop this blue looking colour on their neck and their head, particularly during courtship. They like really vegetative habitats, so they don't like rocky habitats like the war lizard. They like really sunny areas, close to vegetation that they can scuttle off into when they're disturbed. And moving on to our non-native snake species. So I'm going to begin with the confusing one here. Bear with me while I try and explain this. And please save your questions to the break time we've got coming up soon, if you have any. So the grass snake in 2018 was considered a single species across all of Europe. And then a study was released looking into the different lineages of the grass snake across all of Europe. And they determined that there were 3 distinct species. So the species native to Western Europe, so that's most of France, the UK, and anything west of the River Rhine. So the Rhine is the river that runs through parts of France and Germany, and it forms a lot of the border. Anything on the west of that was considered the barred grass snake. So our grass snake here in the UK was elevated to a full species status, the barred grass snake. Anything east of the Rhine in sort of Germany and southern Europe was considered the grass snake. Now, there are various subspecies within these species, so it goes even, into a lower level. But what they did find when they were sampling for the grass snakes, and you can see this in this map, so the blue triangles on this map are the barred grass snake populations that they sampled. There is a red star here somewhere in England, South England. They sampled a subspecies of the grass snake native to sort of South Europe here in England. And there is very little information on where it was and whether it was a large population. They didn't do anything to follow it up. I would love to know more. I would love to know whether they're breeding with our local populations, whether it's a self-sustaining population of grass snakes. But what we do know is that there was at least one individual, maybe a population of grass snakes, non-native to the UK. So I would consider that a non-native species. So we have our native species, the barred grass snake, and the non-native species, the grass snake. And the main difference, if you're looking at the two side by side, is that the grass snake lacks these dark bars that run down the flank. So you can see in this image in the bottom, no dark bars. And that's the main giveaway feature. The other thing they say is that grass snakes have a more prominent yellow collar, but that's going to be very difficult to tell without a side-by-side comparison, because that feature differs amongst individuals anyway. Okay, so we move on to the more simple non-native snake, and that is the Asclepian snake. So the Asclepian snake is well distributed throughout most of mainland Europe. Quite a long snake. Can go up to 2 meters in length, so that's even bigger than our grass snake. It actually gives it its name in Latin, longissimus, meaning long or lengthy, I think. But you only find these in 2 specific places in the UK, and that's Regent's Park in London and Colwyn Bay in Wales. And if you take a look at the snake, you can see it's got this eye stripe similar to the smooth snake. You just won't see this snake on any site where you get smooth snakes. And it's different in coloration. It's a more greeny, olivey colour than the smooth snake. And then you'll sometimes see this light coloured stippling across the body. It's a very nondescript snake. It's just that very average green colour. Sometimes has an eye stripe, sometimes it doesn't. They're very good climbers. They're quite often found in trees, and they will take birds and birds' eggs. But you'll only find them 2 places in the UK. You're very unlikely to find them unless you're actually going out looking for them. Okay, finally, our 2 last non-native species, 2 species of turtle. The top image is the red-eared terrapin. And I used to live in London, and these used to be everywhere. I used to see them all the time. They particularly like either very, very slow-moving water or still water. And they're native to North America, and the local populations are likely a result of pet release. So whether this is due to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I've never been able to tell, but that is the urban legend, is that when that was popular, parents bought their kids these baby red-eared terrapins. Little did they know, they're not so cute when they're adults. They're very aggressive. I think some people call them snappers because they have this tendency to snap at you and bite out at things. And then when it's biting your kids' fingers, when they get flushed down the toilet, they get released into ponds, and that's why we have them all over the place now. I don't know whether their populations are sustaining, so whether they persist in their environment because they lay eggs, and I don't know if their eggs can develop in the sort of temperatures we have here. But we probably have enough of them in the wild that if they could persist, they would do. And then I think less common, but you do see these as well, are European pond turtles. And you can tell the difference from the images quite clearly. European pond turtle has these yellow spots on its head and its neck, but also a darker looking shell as well. These actually used to be native to England or the UK about 8,000 years ago, but a colder climate probably killed most of them off, or at least it made it very difficult to incubate their eggs reliably, so that even if the adults could persist in colder temperatures, it's their eggs that can never incubate and they can never produce enough young to persist. And they're found in really similar habitats to the red-eared terrapins. So wherever you find red-eared terrapins, you may find European pond turtles as well. So that's usually ponds, small lakes, very, very slow, shallow-moving streams or rivers. Okay, so a couple of things before we have a short break. I'm going to talk about the general threats to reptiles, and this is particularly true for our common and widespread species. So if you think back, that's the common lizard, the slow worm, the barred grass snake, and our less common but widespread species, the adder. And the first one is the loss and degradation of habitat. So we've made massive changes in the last few hundred years to how we farm, how we collect timber. So we tend to plant huge monocultures of evergreen trees, which aren't particularly friendly towards biodiversity in general, but particularly for our reptiles as well. And then on top of that, we've had increased urbanization throughout the past few hundred years, and we've made some big changes to how we use our green spaces. So particular habitat that's very good for reptiles has been changed dramatically, and how we use that. So golf courses are a really good example of how we've made habitat that's usually great for reptiles, like sand dunes and heathlands, and turned it into something like a golf course, which is completely useless for them. You just don't find them on these sorts of places. And then related to that, we have a sort of unsympathetic management system for reptiles. So most places are either completely overmanaged so that reptiles don't use them, or they're completely undermanaged. And reptiles need quite a few things to be successful. They need hibernation sites, they need egg laying sites, or 2 of our native species at least need egg-laying sites. And they need very varied structure in terms of the habitat. We tend not to do that so much, widespread anyway. And particularly the loss of heathland has hit our reptile populations very hard. Heathland provides everything a reptile might want in its habitat. And we've lost around 80 to 90% of heathland in the UK over the past 50 or 60 years, or maybe a bit longer. In fact, if you want to find all of our native reptile species in one place, you tend to only get that on heathland in South England. It's the only place you'll find all 6 of them living within the same, proximity. So loosely related to the loss and degradation of good habitat for reptiles is the fragmentation of this habitat. So reptiles colonize very poorly, particularly the adder, which is very site loyal and very loyal to its hibernation sites. It doesn't like to move from one place to another. It will do if given enough time. But the fragmentation, so what we mean by fragmentation is just, if you think of a road splitting one habitat off to another habitat, very little is going to be able to cross that road, reptiles in particular. But we also remove things like hedgerows from our agricultural areas. So if you think of a monoculture of sort of farm crop, that's very difficult for a reptile to cross as well. And without hedgerows that connect these areas, it's almost impossible for them to either colonize new areas or continue to persist in an area that's too small for them. We get what we call genetic depression. So again, in adders, this is really bad. So 90% of all adder populations in the UK consist of less than 10 individuals. And the gene pool is so small, you get genetic inbreeding. So they just get a lot of things wrong with them because they're all inbreeding, and the populations get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they completely die out from the site. Predation from domestic cats can be a problem for species like slow worms. So slow worms are the ones you'll find mostly in urban areas, and these do suffer a lot if there are domestic cats in the area. In fact, you tend not to find slow worms where you get a high density of domestic cats because they all get killed by them. Persecution, maybe not as big a threat as any of the other 3, but certainly it gives the adder very bad press because they are our only venomous snake here, and they have been known to bite dogs, certainly more common than biting humans. But it's a very relatively undeserved reputation. They're not a dangerous species. There's only been 14 recorded deaths in UK history to adder bites. You're far more likely to die from a bee sting or a wasp sting. And if you take the right precautions, i.e. you keep your dog on a lead, it's just not going to get bitten by an adder. Adders take a hell of a lot of winding up before they will bite you. They would much prefer just to slink off than have to strike in defense. So we can do a lot more in terms of interpretation and managing the media with how adders are perceived, and hopefully that would reduce persecution of adders. Persecution just means egg killing. So some people just have a very negative reaction to snakes in general or adders, and the first thought is to kill it. And then less so, but reptile disease has been a sort of problem in the US. It was snake fungal infection was found here on a grass snake in the UK in 2006. And I won't go into much detail, but Guard and Wildlife Health are keeping an eye on that to see if it will have a particularly bad impact on our population. Right now it doesn't, but it is worth looking out for. And if you ever find a snake or a reptile that you think has died of disease, do go to this website and you can submit what you found. And if they think it's worth investigating, they will do. So what conservation measures, general conservation measures can we take for these widespread species? So particularly for grass snakes, or only for grass snakes, as the only egg-laying widespread species. So the other native egg-laying species is the sand lizard. We can provision for the barred grass snake to have places to lay its eggs. So things like leaving large piles of rotting vegetation or dead wood. And in the past, so we're talking over the past, I don't know, 500 years or so, manure piles were everywhere because we relied so much on horses for agriculture, and maybe even, you know, sort of horse-drawn carriages. Everybody had horses. And we don't leave manure piles all over the place like we used to. Manure piles are probably the single best thing you can add to your site for barred grass snakes to lay their eggs in. They like to lay their eggs in anywhere that has a higher temperature than their surrounding environment. And that's exactly what manure piles are, just rotting piles of heat. Identifying and protecting where we think or know reptiles hibernate. So particularly for adders, which are so site loyal, protecting those sites from public disturbance and from dismantling, and then creating more sites for the future. Really good thing to do for reptiles. And then limiting the areas reptiles use for basking, from mowing or grazing. We'll go into a little bit more about the ecology of reptiles and how they bask and when they bask. But areas they are known to bask, keeping them from mowing or grazing, particularly early on in the season, is a really good thing. If reptiles are disturbed too often when they're basking, they will stop using that site. And then in areas where you've got very dense scrub or woodland, creating open glades that the direct sunshine can get through to, particularly on anywhere that's south-facing, is a really good measure. Thermoregulation, I've put thermoregulation here, we'll touch on exactly what that is later on. And then finally, limiting public disturbance. They don't like being disturbed because they just want to collect as much heat as possible without having to use any energy. So if there's many members of public walking past them and disturbing them, they'll stop using the site. And so anywhere that you have reptiles, you can either cordon it off from the public using, or you can create pathways away from those areas that encourage the public to go somewhere else. Okay, so we're going to move on to sort of reptile ecology and the distribution of the common or widespread species. So that's 4 of the UK natives. And we'll begin with the common lizard distribution. So this data is taken from the National Biodiversity Network website. And this is every single record, every single verified record since the NBN has managed to, you know, sort of source records. So these records can stretch back to the late 1800s. I mean, there's very, very few before the 1950s, but just as a disclaimer, this isn't exactly where you'll find them now. This is more of a historical distribution. The reason I took, you know, all of this data and put it into a map is because there's such a paucity of data for reptiles. If I was just to show you the data from the last year or the last 5 years, it would look very sparse. But there are areas where you may not find these now, that there are blue dots. So that's a bit of a disclaimer. But what can we see? What can we see here when we're looking at the distribution of the common lizard? Well, they're pretty widespread. Found, you know, here in the top of Scotland, all the way down to sites in southern England. And there tends to be a blue dot almost everywhere. So they're very widespread, and it probably means they're quite common as well. And they're also our only native reptile to Ireland and Northern Ireland as well. So we have records of common lizards there. So let's take a look at the common lizard seasonal life cycle. What does the average adult get up to in a year? So they tend to leave hibernation in February or March. And after they leave hibernation, and the males tend to leave a little bit earlier, they will shed their first skin. It's called slothing. They will slough their skin. And then breeding occurs quite soon after, so usually in March or April. And during that time, male aggression can be seen, fighting for priority over females. And you'll see both males and females basking in the best spots during March and April. Now, between April and August, the females will incubate their eggs internally. So they incubate their eggs inside of them. This actually gives them their other common name. So there's common lizard, and some people call them the viviparous lizard. And viviparous means giving birth to live young. But they exist within egg form within the female, and then she gives birth to live young. And they don't exist in an eggshell in the same way other reptiles lay eggs. They exist in a sort of egg-like membrane. They do feed off an egg yolk like they would if they were just laid as eggs. And the female is noticeably swollen when she's incubating her eggs. So you can see here, this is a female looking rather chunky, almost definitely incubating eggs there. And that's the best way to tell the difference during this period between April and August. Females do look quite swollen. And they will bask in the best places to help incubate their eggs. That is the benefit to incubating your eggs internally. You can go where the hot spots are. So you give your offspring the best chance at incubating correctly and the best chance to hatch out as live young. And it will give birth in July or August to 4 or 11 young. The older females tend to have more young. And then in August or October, you'll see a lot of common lizards feeding on invertebrates to put on weight to survive the winter. And they're pretty cool to watch when they're hunting, because they'll spot something. Because they're a very fast species, they tend to prey on faster invertebrates like spiders rather than slugs. They'll run up to it and they have to stun it, otherwise it's going to run away. So they grab it in their mouth and they shake it around. It's really cool to watch. You don't really see anything else do that. And then between October and March, they overwinter anywhere that has a really stable temperature. So anywhere that's unlikely to freeze or flood. So dead wood, leaf litter, in underground mammal burrows, in stonework, anywhere they can get in and feel safe and hopefully not freeze to death. So where are you likely to find common lizards? And that's really hard to put your finger on because they're found in most places. You'll find them on coastal areas, in farmland that isn't too intensively farmed. They like grassland areas, woodland edges, or at least woodland that has plenty of direct sunshine able to penetrate the canopy. Heathland and moorland is particularly good for lizards, for common lizards. But they do have a preference for drier habitats where their areas of hibernation aren't likely to flood. You will get them in wetland areas, but they do tend to prefer drier habitats. Now, they're usually a ground dweller, but they will climb up to get to the best basking spots available to them. So you can see a couple here on some drift fencing. They've obviously climbed this to get on top. But they tend to stay on the ground. And they do like any area that's open and sunny and dry, but is relatively near to cover so that when they get frightened, they get scared, they can quickly dash off and hopefully escape. Now, if they do get attacked, they can drop their tail. So dropping their tail just means the tail detaches from their body, and hopefully that's what the predator's got hold of, and it's going to wriggle around for a couple of minutes, and the lizard makes a dashing escape. The tail never really grows back to the same proportions as the original tail, and it probably takes a lot of energy to do so. So we would recommend, unless you're quite familiar with handling lizards and common lizards, probably not best to try and handle them, because if they drop their tail, it doesn't do the individual much good. and they can live up to around 5 or 6 years in the wild. Okay, moving on to slow worm distribution. So we can see they're about as widespread as common lizards. Again, there's no areas that don't particularly have them, but it appears as if they're less common. So there seems to be less blue dots than the common lizards. Now this might be the case, but I suspect this is more because they are far more cryptic than common lizards are. Common lizards like to be in the most exposed, hot, direct places they can be. So they're trying to get all that direct sunshine. So when you walk past them and they scuttle off, you're more likely to see them. And if you're more likely to see them, you're more likely to record them. Slow worms, on the other hand, tend not to like to be in direct sunshine. They take a lot of their heat from items in their environment and tend to stay underneath things. So unless you're physically going out and looking underneath rocks, looking underneath Refugio, you probably won't find slow worms. This isn't always the case. You'll sometimes see slow worms just basking. But I imagine that this is just more of a representation that slow worms are more cryptic than common lizards and therefore are far less recorded. I don't know off the top of my head which is more common, but I would have thought perhaps that there are more slow worms in this country than there are common lizards. But there are no population, total abundance studies on either species. It's really difficult to tell. You may notice there's a single record here in Ireland. There's a site in Ireland where there has been a persistent population of slow worms since the 70s. They got introduced there by some unknown person. They are not native to Ireland, but they do exist there. And they have a really similar seasonal life cycle to common lizards, actually. So they leave hibernation perhaps a little bit later in March. Again, the males tend to come out earlier. They want to slough their skin and they want to fight for breeding rights to the females. So that's, it tends to be April and May is when you see aggression between males, and they'll bite each other and have a bit of a wrestle with the loser slinking off and the male getting the rights to breed with the female. And then the female incubates their eggs internally. Again, they tend to look noticeably swollen, perhaps not quite as swollen as the common lizards, but they can give birth up to 25 young in August to September. So in this, towards the end of August, into September, if you are looking for slow worms, you'll sometimes find huge groups of young slow worms, like a little reptile spaghetti. It's really cool to see. And they are less likely to be seen basking than other reptiles. So you tend to find them underneath things rather than on top of things, like the common lizard. And then in October and March, they overwinter in similar places to the common lizard. And they're found in very similar habitats to the common lizard, almost identical habitats to the common lizard, but it's the slow worms that you'll find mostly in urban areas or urban gardens. Common lizards, not so much, but slow worms love a good compost heap. A compost heap provides everything a slow worm might ever need. I said it doesn't need direct basking areas. It takes heat from its environment, and that's what a compost does. It's a nice big pile of rotting vegetation that provides heat. It provides food. So these like to feed on slugs, things that move a little bit slower. That's what a compost heap is going to attract it to. And then a compost heap just provides great shelter for it as well. So if something does disturb it, it will be able to get inside of the compost heap and hide away very easily. That's why they tend to be found in urban areas with good compost heaps, good rotted vegetation piles. They can live up to 30 years in the wild, so much, much longer than our common lizards. During the breeding season, males will grasp the female behind the head, and breeding can take up to 10 hours. Sounds like an ordeal to me. And they can drop their tails just like the common lizard. So they have tails just like lizards, although it's not quite as obvious because of the lack of legs. And in fact, their Latin name, Anguis fragilis. Fragilis means fragile because they really, really easily drop their tail. And it never grows back to anything like the original tail. It's usually just about 1 centimetre in length, and it's very discoloured in comparison to the rest of its body. If you ever pick up a slow worm, make sure you're always picking it up in the first 2/3 of the body, I would say. It's not good for its tail to come off. Okay, moving on to the barred grass snake. And I think this is the first time we can see a big difference in distribution to either of our other common species. And you can see a real tendency to find them in the southeast. And then as you get further north, they become much rarer, and they're almost non-existent here in the northern reaches, the Highlands of Scotland. I think there's one record here. I don't even know from when that was. And this is most likely because they need consistent temperatures for their eggs to develop properly. And you just don't get those sort of temperatures in northern Scotland and northern England. Well, Scotland and northern England. I mean, you do get them here. They're just not as common because they just won't be as successful at laying their eggs and their eggs hatching out into young. And we'll touch on why they're probably more common in the southeast than the southwest in their ecology. So they tend to leave hibernation in March or April. So again, probably a bit later than our common lizard species. And there's a pattern here, there's a pattern emerging. The males tend to leave hibernation a little bit earlier. And again, this is to aid them to slough that skin so that they're in good breeding condition. And then the warm weather supposedly aids in their sperm production as well. And then in April and May, the breeding begins, and you can get these pretty cool, probably a little bit disgusting, mating balls. And this is where many different males try to breed with the same female. I've never seen one, but I imagine it looks like some sort of weird biological tangleweed. And it's almost always the biggest male, so the most mature male, as they just get bigger and bigger in age, that breeds with the female. And then in June or July, the female will lay her eggs in a suitable location. And you tend to see far less activity in the summer months. So June, July, and August, you will see them, but you won't see them as easily because they just don't need to bask as often. Now the juveniles are born towards the end of summer, and then as autumn approaches, you get the second peak in activity where they're all trying to feed as much as possible to put on as much weight to last the winter. And actually the highest mortality rate in the life cycle of the grass snake is this first wintering period. They just don't put on enough calories to last that length of time without eating. Because they're smaller, they're more susceptible to cold temperatures. And then in October or March, the barred grass snake will hibernate. Again, similar places to our other reptiles, anywhere that's undisturbed and that has a stable temperature. So they're generally a lowland species, don't like high altitudes, and they have a real affinity for water. And this is probably why you find many of them in the southeast, because there are more water bodies in the southeast, I think, than most other places in the UK. And they tend to like water because they're amphibian specialists. So they tend to feed on frogs and newts, but they will take things like fish, and as they're bigger and older, small mammals, birds as well, if they can get hold of them. In fact, most reptiles will eat anything they can just get their mouth around. That tends to be the only criteria, but they do have preferences. So they can be found in farmland, grassland, heathland, moorland, woodland, but it tends to be these habitats that are close to some sort of water body where you find grass snakes. Now they're completely non-venomous. Their only defensive mechanism is to spray pretty nasty liquid all over you. And they'll flail their tails around to get it, you know, in your nostrils and all over your face, and it kind of stinks. I think it's supposed to simulate sort of rotting flesh, because it will play dead, and it's their attempt at persuading that predator that it's been dead for a long time. It smells, and if you eat it, it's not going to turn out well for you. So if you are going to handle grass snakes, and I think this is maybe one of the best reptile species to handle, because there's no chance of it dropping its tail. You can't handle adders, because they will bite you and they are venomous. You need to be prepared to get this musk all over your hands. But in my opinion, it's a very small price to pay, because they're my favorite reptile species. They're really cool, striking, and they get up to such big sizes. They can produce a real wow factor for people. Now the females will lay between 10 to 40 eggs, and you sometimes get many females laying their eggs in the same place, and you can get around 200 eggs altogether, which is a lot of eggs, a lot of small baby grass snakes. Okay, our final species we're going to take a look at. So you can see here that they are about as widespread as the lizard species. You can get them here in the very north of mainland Scotland, all the way down to sites in southern England. They are extant from a few places in the Midlands. I think it's definitely the East Midlands. So this map isn't particularly accurate now, I know that for sure. Adders have probably taken the biggest hit in numbers out of the 4 species I've just spoken about. They're definitely not as common as barred grass snakes, but they are far more widespread. And they tend to leave hibernation quite early. So similar times that the common lizards are going to be leaving hibernation. Again, males first come out, start basking. They want to shed that skin. And they'll quite often just find the nearest available place to bask outside their hibernaculum. And that means they'll quite often bask in groups, because they tend to communally hibernate. So you'll quite often see many, many adders in one place basking just as they've come out of hibernation. And then in March or April, breeding begins. And you get this ritual called the Dance of Adders. If you've been following Spring Watch over the last few weeks, you may have seen a video of the Dance of the Adders. Now, this isn't a courtship ritual between a male and a female. This is actually 2 males fighting for priority. What they do is they sort of wriggle back and forth on top of each other, and they're trying to force one another to the ground to proclaim their superiority. And this is quite common actually in a lot of venomous snakes. They are true gentlemen, and there is a gentleman's rule that they shall not bite one another, which is probably a good thing because they're venomous. If they end up biting each other like the common lizards and the slowworms do, there are going to be no males to actually breed. So a lot of venomous snakes actually just wrestle with their bodies, and there's absolutely no activity in the head. They don't compete with the heads of their teeth at all, because they are venomous. And then during April or September, you're unlikely to see many adders together. So after the breeding, they tend to disperse. And then in August or September, the juveniles are born. This is usually at the same place is where the female overwinter. The female moves very, very little in her lifetime. She tends to use the same hibernation site every single year. She'll find a nice basking spot nearby. She waits for the males to come and find her. And then she sits in that spot to incubate her young and then gives birth in that spot. And only then does she begin to move. I mean, they'll move if they have to, if they feel like there is a threat to them. But if they don't have to move, they won't. Females are very stationary, I guess I would call it. And then in September, October, the adults, again, they begin to congregate in the hibernation areas that they previously used, and they will remain in hibernation or brumation. I touched a little bit on that in the break until early spring. Now, adders are really highly associated with heathland and moorland, but you'll find them in coastal areas as well, wooded areas with sunny glades or at the edges of woodland areas. Is where you'll most likely find them. And they're more of a sit and wait predator than grass snakes. So grass snakes will quite often go on a hunt, and you'll see them swimming about looking for amphibians. Adders are more likely to wait until a small mammal, which is their preferred prey, to scurry past them, and they'll strike at it. They'll inject them with that venom, and the poor mouse or the poor vole won't get very far, only a couple of meters or so. Maybe not even that. And then it'll smell its way to it and devour it. Every time you see a snake flicking its tongue out and wafting it back and forward, it's actually using it to decide where it wants to go. It follows the scent trails of things. So that's how it finds its prey once it's dead. It follows its scent trail. Now, we don't know why, but the females actually fast whilst incubating their young. So they incubated their young for like 3 or 4 months, and they will not eat. They'll sit in one spot and they will not eat. And this is definitely detrimental to their overall body condition. But no one knows quite why they do it. But it's once they've given birth to their young that they will actually start feeding and maybe start hunting. Okay, we're going to move on to reptile conservation reptile conservation status and their legal protection. I'll try to rush through it. I'll only maybe touch on it for a couple of minutes because it is quite dry, but it's definitely good to know what protection they are afforded. Now, every single reptile, and this is every native reptile, are protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So that's protection from intentional or reckless killing or injury. And you cannot sell any individual unless you can prove that it was not taken from the wild and was in fact captive bred. So that does mean you can take a reptile out of the wild and you can keep it. Now, as a conservation charity and as a conservationist, I would never recommend that. Obviously, this is bad. You shouldn't ever be taking any wildlife out of its natural habitat, in my opinion. Actually, that's not exactly true. I think it can be very beneficial to raise tadpoles and maybe caterpillars for kids and things like that. But always release it back into the wild. But I wouldn't ever take a reptile species out of the wild. Why would you? They're not doing well. It's not good for them. And you're not going to be able to provide it everything it needs anyway. Now, the smooth snake, sand lizard, and leatherback turtle are further protected under the Wildlife and Countryside Act from capturing. So you cannot capture them whatsoever. You cannot disturb them whatsoever. So this includes surveying for them in any method that isn't just looking with your eyes. And you cannot destroy any of their habitat that they use for shelter. So they're further protected by the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Now, adders cannot be kept under the Dangerous Wild Animal Act. So you cannot take an adder out of the wild and keep it. It is considered a dangerous wild animal. You can get a license that circumvents this so that you can captively keep them, you can captively breed them, and then you can transport them. And official translocation of adders, I think you do need a license for this, a dangerous wild animal license. Now, the smooth snake and sand lizard are our most highly protected reptile, or at least terrestrial reptile species, and you do need a European protected license to survey for them, to handle them. And this is due to the European Habitats Directive. I think this directive was due to what we call a Convention on Biological Diversity. They tend to hold these every so often, and from these conventions, directives are issued, and then legislation at a national level is issued. And European law governs how we protect smooth snakes and sand lizards. This may change due to the fact we're leaving the EU. I don't know. And I don't care to predict how it will turn out either. It's also worth considering that all reptiles are considered a priority species under the UK post-2010 Biodiversity Framework. So this Biodiversity Framework is the successor to our biodiversity action plans that we rolled out before 2010. And what these were supposed to do is identify what species need to be given a little bit of extra consideration in our management plans. So anything that's considered a priority species now, if you have them on your site, they tend to need a little bit more sympathetic management for them to be able to persist on those sites and hopefully be even more successful and spread to other sites as well. But there is no legal obligation to provide any habitat management for any priority species. That's just the way it is. Okay, so we're going to do a short identification quiz. So we're going to put some of that knowledge that you've been collecting to good use. There's going to be 8 different species, and I want you to try and identify what species it is, and if you can, identify the sex of the species. You won't be able to do this for all of them. Some of the images have limited information, and that's on purpose, because that's the kind of info that you're going to get when you're out and about looking for reptiles. So do your best at identifying the sex. You should be able to identify what species it is. Now, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds per image. But if you want, you can use the Dragon Finder app. So this is the app I asked you to download. If you know how to use it, or if you've used it before, give it a go. It might be able to help you. But you're only going to have about 30 seconds. So hopefully you've got a pen and a paper nearby. Just jot down your answer to each question, and then we'll go over whether you got it right or not. So this isn't like the link that I sent out before. This is just going to be on the screen. Okay, number 1. Can you guess what the species is? Moving on to number 2. Moving on to number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Number 6. Number 7. And finally, number 8. Okay. So we're going to go over these, and then we're going to take a break after I've revealed the answers. What I am going to do is, I wonder if I can do this without stopping sharing my screen. No, I can't. I'm going to give everybody the option to unmute themselves if they want to. There's nothing more satisfying than shouting out the answers to a pub quiz. So hopefully some of you will have some correct answers. So yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to, although if there is a lot of background noise on your end, please do just mute yourself. Does anybody know what we've got here? Anyone care to take a guess? Anyone brave enough?
Nada.
Yep. So if you've got yourself an adder, give yourself a point, and a bonus point if you've got male adder as well. So that's what I was looking for. So hopefully you saw this zigzag pattern running the length of the body. And this is a sort of greyish colour, I would say, which probably gives it away as a male, I would say. Maybe it's a female, I don't know. But I would certainly guess at male adder. Well done if you got that. Number 2. What did you get for number 2? Did anyone put common lizard?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think you can tell this is a common lizard and not a sand lizard. As a sand lizard, it doesn't have, well, sand lizard would have those creamy eye spots. I can't see anything here. Maybe you thought it was a wall lizard because it's on a rock and it's sort of clambering onto it. But it doesn't have the long limbs, it doesn't have the longer head. You can't see its tail very well, but if you see a lizard in this country, it's almost definitely a common lizard and not a wall lizard. But you can't see the top of this particularly well, but you can maybe just about see some form of vertebral stripe that a wall lizard probably wouldn't have. So you've got a common lizard, well done. It is a common lizard. I wouldn't guess the sex of this because I can't see the top of it. and you really need to see the top of the lizard, a common lizard at least, to tell the sex. To look for that tail bulge, to maybe look at the size of its head, and to maybe check to see whether there's a relatively unbroken line down its center. So I wouldn't guess the sex of this. It wouldn't be accurate. Okay, did anybody get number 3?
Female is slowworm.
Yeah.
Yep. So well done. I think that's Pablo. You've got a slowworm here. So smooth, shiny skin gives it away as a slowworm. Can't see its head particularly well. Can't see its tail, but it's that smooth, glossy skin that gives it away as a slowworm. And female is correct as well. So well done on getting that. You can see the dark flanks here, just about, maybe on the other side as well. You can also see those sort of very broken dark lines running the length of the body. You wouldn't see those on a male. It's a more uniform colour across its entire body. So female slowworm. Okay, what about this one?
Newt.
Yep. So this is the obligate red herring of the quiz. We have a newt here. They're trying to catch people out. Maybe they put lizard. This is a small newt. So there are a few species of newts, and 2 of them are smaller. I can't tell what it is from this image, so I would call it a small newt. But you can tell it's a newt and not a lizard, because this one is still relatively wet and it's got shiny skin. It doesn't have scales, and it looks very small in comparison to a common lizard. So you can see this is very, very zoomed in. It's probably actually a young newt. You can't quite count the toes, but you can tell from its sort of shiny skin that it's a newt and not a lizard. So well done if anyone put newt. Okay, number 5. Anybody care to take a guess? So we've got an adder here. That zigzag pattern down the body. Definitely large enough to be an adult, because it's got a brown zigzag pattern. I would say this is almost definitely a female adder. So if you got a female, well done. It's not small enough to be a juvenile, so definitely a female adder. Number 6. Did you get number 6?
A male slowworm.
Yep. Did you manage to see the very subtle blue flecks?
Yeah, only just.
Yep. So this is how subtle it can be on some individuals. Just 1 or 2. But it has that uniform colour throughout. It doesn't have the dark flanks of the female. So this is actually a male, an adult male slowworm. And number 7. Number 7, we've got the barred grass snake. So you see the bars running down the length of the body here, and then you can see that yellow colour, the yellow collar, which gives it away as a grass snake. And I know I was talking about how grass snake is non-native, barred grass snakes are native. If you just call it a grass snake, no one's going to call you out on it. It's fine. But if you wanted to be technically correct, it's a barred grass snake. We're just calling it a grass snake. If you see a grass snake in this country, it's almost always a barred grass snake. I have so little information on that introduced population of grass snakes from South Europe that I imagine 99.9% of the time it's going to be a barred grass snake. So you very, very rarely need to make that distinction. So I'll accept barred grass snake or grass snake for that. And then finally, common lizard again. So another common lizard. And you can tell it's a common lizard. It doesn't have the creamy eye spots of the sand lizard. It doesn't, I mean, you may be confused with a wall lizard, but that tail is definitely not 2/3 the length of the body. It's probably only about half the length. And it's got a general common lizard appearance. It's got that dorsolateral stripe. It's a bit spotty, a bit brown, a bit yellow, a bit drab looking, in my opinion. And it's really difficult to guess the sex of this one. So I would probably say female. I don't think there's a bulge. I can't see a bulge at the base of the tail. The line's relatively unbroken. It's a bit broken here. But I think that's a relatively small head. Probably female. Maybe 60% sure that that's female. But if someone said, no, actually, this is a male, that wouldn't surprise me. I probably wouldn't stand my ground. So maybe a female, but definitely a common lizard. So well done if you got common lizard. Oh, yeah, so I just wanted to start this part off with, I'm going to give you this image here on the right. I want to see if you can spot a reptile in this picture. And what I'm really trying to highlight here is how hard it actually is when you're out and about and there's 1,000 things around you, where it is to find reptiles and how hard it can be to see them because they're so well hidden sometimes. And another member of staff in Scotland was delivering a similar course, and they used this image as a way to highlight this. And I liked it so much that I decided to nick it and include it in mine. To give you even more clues, it's an adder. I think it's a small juvenile adder. Can you see it in the picture? I couldn't find it. I couldn't find it whatsoever. I'll give you maybe 10 more seconds just to see. It can get pretty boring just looking at the same thing again and again and not seeing anything. But if any of you manage to get that,
Whoa.
that is sometimes what you're looking for. Yeah. It's just so well hidden. And here's a close-up. You can just about see the zigzag pattern, but you can see that it's very snake-shaped. There's no doubt about what it actually is. But when you're walking around your sites, it's so easy to just miss them. That really demonstrates that. So we're going to move on to a couple of reptile survey methods that you can employ to survey for particularly the common and widespread species. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about how reptiles manage their temperature and how we can exploit that to better design our surveys with an understanding of thermoregulation. So that's just how any species manage their temperature. We can better design our surveys for getting the best possible results. So reptiles are ectothermic. That means they use their environment to thermoregulate. So humans are endothermic. We employ a lot of internal processes to manage our heat. So that's heating up and cooling down. Whereas UK reptiles will use their environment to heat up and cool down. So for UK reptiles, the preferred temperature range is between 25 and 30 centigrade. And they primarily heat up to this temperature through basking in direct sunshine. But sometimes they will take that heat, that temperature from items in their environment. Slow worms in particular like to do this. And it's worth noting they use the environment to cool down if they're too hot as well. So a lot of people call reptiles cold-blooded, which isn't entirely accurate because they can be hot-blooded. They use their environment to heat up their blood and cool down their blood. But certainly in the morning, and certainly in this country, they're more likely to be looking to heat themselves up than cool themselves down. Now, adders and common lizards are particularly efficient at thermoregulation, which is why you tend to get them in Scotland more than other species. And they're very good at this because they can actually flatten their bodies so that there's more surface area for the sun to hit. And if the items that they're flattening their bodies on are warm, they can take a lot of heat up that way as well. Now, when is the best time to survey? So there tends to be two best periods in the year, and that tends to be March to May, and then September to October. You will find reptiles from as early as February all the way through to October. So that includes the middle of the summer as well, but they do tend to be less active then. Now, the best time of day tends to be the sort of, I don't know if early to mid-late morning, and then again in the late afternoon to early evening. And this does depend on the weather. So the best temperature to go out recording reptiles is going to be between 19 and 18 centigrade. But if it's really cold, they're going to be out later in the morning and earlier in the evening. And if it's really warm, the opposite is true. Now, in cooler temperatures than this, bright, direct sunshine is the best time. So you're going to get colder temperatures in February, March, where it's very often below 9 centigrade. So during these months, any day where there's bright, direct sunshine, you're more likely to find reptiles. And in contrast, on days above 18 degrees, you want those hazy, cloudy days where there's no direct sunshine, so they can't take as much heat from direct sun, but they'll be out basking as much as possible and taking in as much of that ambient temperature as they can. Now, any sort of heavy rain or even light, consistent rain is unsuitable. You probably won't find reptiles when it's raining. The only exception to this tends to be when you get short bursts of rain, so particularly in April when you have April showers, and then bouts of sunshine directly after, because that rain cools them down very quickly, but then they want to get out into that direct sun to heat themselves up because of that lost temperature, and they'll be out basking. But if it's consistently rainy, they just won't be out in it. You'll find it very difficult to find them. Any sort of windy day, they tend not to like as well, because that will cool them down. Okay, so when you are looking for reptiles, what do you want to consider? What areas do you sort of want to consider best places to look for reptiles? So there's a few things that I've got listed here, and I'll touch on a few of them. So vegetation structure is probably the most important one. And what they really like is the interface between two or more different habitats. So where one habitat changes from, say, one to another, like scrub to grassland, we call this an ecotone, where that transition happens. And it's that ecotone that you want to be training your gaze to look for reptiles. They really like to be close to cover, and they like areas of different structural diversity. So it's habitat interfaces that you want to be looking for. The topography is very important as well, so they tend to be found less in areas of high altitude. So if you're up high, you probably won't be finding as many reptiles as if you're down low in the lowlands. And then connectivity and history is very important as well. If there's no known history of reptiles in an area, you probably won't find them, funnily enough, and particularly if there's a lack of connectivity. So if there are areas that are well connected to other areas that you do know there are reptiles, it's definitely worth considering setting up a survey there to see whether they're spreading, whether they're using those areas to spread. Okay, so we're specifically going to look at the easiest way to survey for reptiles now. And that's just something we call the visual encounter. And you'll do a visual encounter as a transect. And by transect, what we mean is basically a walk that starts at point A and finishes at point B. And at any time between those 2 points, you'll record what you see, and you're specifically looking out for your target species. So in this case, our target species is going to be reptiles. So it's basically just taking a walk and looking for reptiles. This is the posh name for it, visual encounter or transect. And why is it good? It's super low effort. It's not good weather right now, where I am at least, but if I wanted to go out on a reptile survey, I could do so in the next 10 minutes, because all I need is, well, a pair of walking boots and the will to go and do it. That's all. You don't need any equipment whatsoever. It's really low effort. You also don't need any permission. So as long as there's public access to the site, I don't need to let anybody know that I am doing a survey on their site. Doesn't mean they won't be interested, but I certainly don't need permission. Now, it's not particularly good for detecting species like the slow worm. I mentioned they like to be underneath things, whereas common lizards and snakes tend to either bask on top of things or in direct sunshine. And it's particularly inappropriate for determining absence. So this is definitely true for professional ecologists that will be looking at whether a species is on the site and then saying, we are confident this species isn't on the site and you can develop here, here, and here. You might go out 20 times over the season and never see a reptile. And it might be that you were just really unlucky. Just because you haven't seen them doesn't mean they weren't present. And the other method that we touch on is a much better survey for determining absence. In fact, there's a number of times you can do the next survey that gives you a confidence interval that the species is absent. But just going out to look for reptiles, because they're so shy and they're so cryptic, doesn't mean they're not there. And then on top of that, survey results tend not to be comparable between surveyors. So every time you go out and do a survey, you accrue something called survey effort. And survey effort is a combination of how many times you go out, how stringent your survey is, but also the competency of the surveyor. Now, a professional ecologist that's been doing this for years and years and years and knows the site like the back of their hand is going to get different results to someone who is just starting to pick this up, you know, and might not be as good at looking at where they are, might not be as fast as IDing them. So that if you're comparing survey results between those two people, they're just not going to be comparable. You're not going to have the same sort of survey effort. So how do you do it? How do you, so let's say you've decided where you want your transect. How do you go about doing a visual survey? So you walk relatively slowly compared to your normal pace, and you just scan ahead, maybe a few meters ahead of you. If you've got binoculars, you can use these for sort of looking at hot spots that are ahead of you. Tread as lightly as possible. This isn't always going to be the case. If it's very long grass, you're not going to be able to tread lightly, but your footsteps are going to scare away some species. And if you can, try and have your shadow behind you so that, one, it's not scaring off anything in front of you, but also it's really hard to see in your shadow, inside of your shadow, when you've got direct sun in your eyes. You can hardly see a thing, so it's much better to have it behind you. And you want to listen for movement. You've got to be quite patient. So again, you've got to walk relatively slowly. And if you think you've heard a reptile, you know, scuttle off into the undergrowth, slither off into the undergrowth, you can just take a few steps back and wait. Now, common lizards are particularly prone to this. They'll almost always go back to the same spot after they've been disturbed, and it only takes 5 or so minutes. Adders like to do it as well, and sometimes grass snakes. If you just wait a little bit, they will quite often come back, and then you'll be able to get a real good look at them. You'll be able to tell what species they are. You'll be able to record all of that useful data. And look out for sort of mosaic basking. I'll show you an image of this later on. But reptiles, as we saw, are very hard to spot sometimes. So you just need to be very observant. And you just get better at this as time goes on. So what habitats are good? So let's say you've got a huge site and you've got a limited amount of time to do your survey. But that site has many different habitats. Now, what habitats should you be focusing on? I won't go all of these, but I'll touch on some of the better ones. So do feel free to write these down. The best place is probably always going to be heathland. Heathland is so good for reptiles because it's dry, it's usually well drained, it heats up particularly well, and it quite often has very varied structure in the vegetation. So areas of heathland are most likely going to be the best places to survey for reptiles. But you have other places as well. South-facing slopes are very good. If they get a lot of sunshine throughout the day, do take a look at south-facing slopes, particularly if they are close to cover. So you can see there's some scrub here and there's some woodland at the back. If there are basking reptiles on here, they will be able to disperse to quite easily. If you live near a lot of farmland, like a lot of people do, farmland makes up a huge amount of our rural space. You want to be looking at the hedgerow, so where the farmland meets, hopefully, a little bit of a verge where you've got grass and then you've got a hedge. And it's probably at the base of that grass where there's maybe going to be a bit of a path where you want to be looking. But these are some of the best places that you can look for if you've got them on your sites for reptiles. So where to look? And if you're going to take anything away from this, if you're going to forget it all, if you're doing a visual survey, remember it's the habitat interfaces, it's that ecotone, that transition from one habitat to another that you want to be looking at. That's where you want to be training your gaze. So in this image here, this is either gorse or heather. You want to be looking where it meets the longer grass. Here in the middle, probably not going to see reptiles, but at the edges, that's where you sort of want to be looking. So you want to walk along and look between the edges where one habitat meets the next, and keeping away from anywhere that's just a monoculture of habitat. So we've got some heather here, and if I was here on this site, I would be looking at this path. I'd be looking at where the heather meets the path. I'd be looking just at the very edge on either side. Are there any reptiles using that area for basking? Then I'd maybe walk a little bit further up here, maybe where there's a few of these trees, underneath the trees where the heather meets the trees. That's where I'll be looking. If you've got any areas with varied height structure, so you can see here the difference in size and extent of the, I think it just looks like young woodland regeneration, or at least scrub. It's going to be very good for reptiles. So if you've got a site with a particular area that has varied height structure, it's going to be really good to go take a look at. And the edges of habitat. So I mentioned how stonework can be an excellent overwintering area for reptiles. So particularly towards the beginning of the season, if I was here, I'd be looking at the base of this stone wall where it meets this sort of brushy vegetation, looking to see whether any reptiles have crawled out and are doing some early basking. And then it maybe looks like this is a field. I'll be looking at where this longer scrubby vegetation meets the field, the edges of habitats. And then any areas that are close to shelter with good direct sunlight. Bonus points if it's south-facing. South-facing sites get sunshine from the very start of the day all throughout until the sun goes down. So it makes them particularly good places for reptiles. So you can see here in this image, it looks quite sunny, and they've got this dead scrub here, and then longer, thicker scrub at the back they can escape into if they get disturbed. You'll be looking anywhere down here and maybe down there as well. And this is mosaic basking. So a lot of reptiles will only expose part of their body to direct sun. And I'm assuming this is just some sort of defense against a predator, but it makes them a lot more difficult to see. This is a very zoomed in image, but if we took a few steps back, a few meters back, this would look, well, it would be much harder to spot. You can see how well it blends into the sort of vegetation around it. So you can see here a couple of adders, and they're basking in that habitat interface. We've got some scrub at the back here, and this is the shorter grass. And this is just because as soon as they get disturbed, that's exactly where they're going to go. No one's going to get into this impenetrable scrub. It looks like either a rose or some bramble. It's going to be really hard to get them and follow them. That's why they like to do it. That's why they're in that ecotone. And you can see here, a common lizard on a log pile. You can see exactly where it's going to go if you disturb it. It's got somewhere to escape to. Got another common lizard here. It looks like to be a sunny spot. Can't take too much away from that image. But it's probably in a sunny spot that's close to cover. And if you are near any water bodies, particularly later on in the season, keep your eye out for grass snakes swimming. They will just get into ponds to cross it, to get from one area to another, perhaps look for a female. But they will actively hunt in ponds as well. So later on in the season when they start hunting more regularly, and they only feed maybe once every 2 to 3 weeks, they will go into water and you'll see them swimming about. Just about see the head there. Sneaky little snake. Okay, so moving on to the second method. And the second method is just using artificial refugio to draw reptiles into a hotspot where they're going to bask on a regular basis. So we want to provide an area that, one, heats up closer, heats up faster than its surrounding environment, and two, provides a bit of cover so it feels safe underneath it. We do this with artificial refugio. Now this is a really good method for basically all of the British species. So you'll get snakes and slow worms underneath them, and you'll get common lizards on top of them as well. You tend not to find them underneath quite as often as you do on top. But they're drawn to these areas because they heat up quickly. And it's an advertisement to the species saying, if you come here, you'll heat up quickly, you'll be able to go about your daily business much faster than if you went to go and bask somewhere else. So it draws them to whatever you've put down. And this method allows a better estimation of abundance. You can do some really cool things with capturing the species, taking a note of how many you captured, marking them somehow. This doesn't have to be physically marking them. You might just take a photograph that you can identify that individual from again in the future. And then you can do some maths on how many you recapture in comparison, how many you've recaptured based on the mark to how many you've only captured once, to give you an estimation of the population of that species within an area. And then using that, you can identify what are key sites for reptiles. Where do you have a lot of reptiles? Where are they doing well? And then you can use that information to connect other habitats up to those areas that are doing well, so that future generations of that species can disperse. Now, artificial refugia is very costly. So one of these mats can cost anywhere from, I don't know, £5 to £6 or £7, and you tend to need quite a lot of these mats to put over a relatively small area. And we'll touch on how many you need in the next few slides. And it does require high initial effort. So even before you start the survey, you need to identify where you want to put the mats. You need to go out and actually place them 2 or 3 weeks before your first survey begins. You need to number them, you need to map them, you need somewhere to store them. There is that high initial effort. If you are going to place mats, you are going to need landowner permission. And some people might not want you to put mats out. They kind of do just look like rubbish, sort of strewn across your site. So if you remember the public and you approach, a land manager or an owner and say, "Can I put some rubbish on your site?" Maybe they'll say no. And then I've spoken about how disturbance is really bad for reptiles, and this can actually increase the disturbance. So just out of curiosity, the public are going to be approaching these mats. They'll probably be taking a look underneath them. If that happens enough, the reptiles aren't going to stand for it. It's really not going to do them very good. Okay, so what are the best materials to use as your refugia? So in the bottom here, we've got some corrugated metal, most likely tin. So some people call this method tinning, because the most popular, and some people maybe say best material is tin. And it's particularly good after it's weathered for a couple of years, and it's not shiny, so it doesn't reflect the heat quite as much. And it just feels more natural to the reptile to be either on top or underneath. So tin, quite a common material. And then you get shed felt as well, which is far cheaper, but possibly the worst material you could use. It gets waterlogged very easily, and it definitely lacks longevity compared to tin. And then you get the one in between, bitumen. So you can see at the top here, this is bitumen, and it's a sort of in between sort of shed felt and corrugated metal. And in my opinion, I think this might be the best one if we consider all of them and all the positives. In fact, where I've used bitumen on sites where I've also had other materials, I tend to get the best results. I don't know why that is. And that might just be anecdotal and not true for everybody else. But when you're placing your refugia, you want to press it as close down to the ground as possible. You want the vegetation underneath it to die off so that it lays as flat to the ground as it possibly can. So you want to press it as close to the ground as possible. And you tend to want it on the edge of dense vegetation. So this is a really good spot for it here. Again, it's that habitat interface. So you've got scrub here going into grassland, and it's in between that you want to place your refugia. You want it in relatively sunny locations so they heat up quickly. You don't want them in shade. You want direct sunshine so they heat up quickly. Reptiles are going to be drawn to them. And you want them away from the public or any livestock, and kind of away from where these animals might be squashed. So leading up to wherever you place your mat, you kind of want a clear runway. You don't want somewhere that might be suitable for reptiles to be basking, so that you're disturbing them to get to your square. And you need about 5 or 10 of these refugia per hectare as a minimum. A hectare is not particularly big. A hectare is about 100 by 100 meters, I think. So if you've got a huge site with loads of habitat suitable for reptiles, you can see how that cost is going to add up very quickly. If you're looking at 30, 40 refugia, that's £200–300 that you're going to be spending on it. That's when shed felt becomes the most attractive option because it's the cheapest. So it's worth noting you do get pre-existing refugia. So you know, maybe like me, you can't afford to load up all the sites that you like to visit on Refugio. It's worth taking a look as to whether there's something that's already exists there and that might be considered a Refugio for reptiles. So old rusty bits of metal, road signs, anything that's been discarded that's going to provide shelter for a reptile and hopefully provide a bit of heat for them as well. Okay, so I'm just, yeah, this is the bit where I would sort of give you the option to touch and feel some of the different materials, and we talk about what's good about some of them, what's bad about some of them. We'd probably go place some out and about, and I'll tell you where the best places might be, where hot spots might be. So I'm kind of just going to show you a few images and, you know, talk through a few things, trying to make it as practical as possible. So you can see here we've got some felt. It's a really good idea to label your Refugio if you're using them. Ask the public not to disturb them. Let them know it's a wildlife survey. Perhaps a few of them will respect that and they actually will leave it alone. Definitely a good thing to do that. This isn't a very good size. The recommended size is 1 meter by 1/2 meter. This looks to be 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. So that's probably half the size that's best for it. Again, not the best size, but whoever's done this survey, they've numbered them. That's a really good thing to do. So if you number your Refugio, it's going to help you find them later on in the season. So you may only get to visit your Refugio 4 times during the season, and I think the recommended visits is between 4 and 6. If you visit 6 times during, I think, March to June, and you don't find any reptiles, there's a 95% chance you don't have reptiles on your site. But over that season, over that period, things are going to change. Vegetation is going to grow up around it. It's going to make them difficult to find. So numbering them is, 1, going to help you collect them back up at the end of the season much easier. And 2, if you've got them on a map, if you've numbered a map, it's going to help you if you can't remember where they are or the vegetation has changed dramatically. And also if you're sharing maps between surveyors, it's going to help them find out wherever you've put them as well. So always number your mats. This is the best size. This is 1/2 meter by 1 meter. This one's corrugated bitumen. So corrugated just means it's that wavy sort of design. And that structure really helps with reptiles being able to get underneath it. So when you approach your mat, you know, approach relatively cautiously and slowly. Keep an eye out for any common lizards on top and record any common lizards you might see. And then when you lift it, just take it from one corner all the way up to an almost vertical position, and then sort of take your time looking underneath as to whether you might have anything. So make sure you sort of scan the entire area underneath, you know, not just the center. And you're taking a minute or so just to look for any reptiles that might be using it. And you can see here we've got some felt and just how easy it disintegrates. You might only get 1 or 2 years out of it. That's particularly true if you maybe have livestock on the area. They like to munch on the felt. They like to give it a bit of a taste, and that really speeds up the disintegration process. You can see how that it becomes so waterlogged as well over time that reptiles tend not to like to use it because they like dry, sunny, warm areas, not waterlogged areas. And you won't always find anything. Yeah, you can see certainly here in this one, there's nothing there. But keep an eye out for any reptile skin or sloths. You can actually tell the species based on the scale patterns. You should be able to find resources online for that. I don't have anything in the workshop. You can see here there's a couple of probably juvenile slow worms. Quite easy to see in an image, but I imagine that's harder to see when you're there. They can blend in, So definitely take your time. Nothing underneath this one, but this is what you're trying to do to the vegetation, trying to kill it off so the mat lays as close to the ground as possible. And keep your eye out for other species as well. So we've got a common toad here. You can submit sightings of amphibians using the Dragon Finder app as well. But also keep an eye out for any interesting invertebrates or any small mammals. So mice, voles and shrews will use them. When they eat berries, how they discard the seed can quite often give you an indication of what small mammal is underneath the mats as well. They'll quite often use it to shelter under and eat. And you'll see little piles of seeds. Looks like we've got a male slowworm here underneath this mat. Okay, and here we go. I'm just going to show you a quick video on the Dragon Finder app and some of the work we've done with groups using the Dragon Finder app. And then I'll go into a little bit more info on why it's so good to use it and how you do use it. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second because I need to turn on share computer sound so you can hear the video. Okay, so just a couple of minutes. You should be able to hear it fine. If you can't hear it, please post in the chat. It probably means I've done something wrong, but hopefully you'll be able to hear this.
We did surveying this year as part of the Dragon Finder project, and it helps you to then identify what species you have on site, and then it helps you to create our management plan and work plan for next year, because then we can identify areas where we might put in extra habitat piles or where we might put in the survey mats. So it does help immensely, yes.
I think lots of people don't realise how rich and diverse these marshes are. They often use them as a means just to get from A to B. The opportunity came up for a training day to monitor amphibians and reptiles with Froglife. It's a really good way of coming out and experiencing the marsh throughout the season on a regular basis and take regular observations of it rather than just a casual walk.
I got introduced to Froglife, so I do a reptile survey at the Waterworks Nature Reserve. Oh, it's just fun lifting up the mats to see what's underneath. Everybody's jealous because it's the most successful site.
Okay, so we're moving on to what the Dragon Finder app is and why you should use it. So the Dragon Finder app is Froglife's identification and sort of data management app. So if you see an amphibian or reptile species, you can use it to help you identify it. There's a sort of question elimination process that asks you about different features, and then it should give you an answer as to what you've seen, and then you can actually make a submission, a data submission using the app that goes straight to us, that we then share on an annual basis with the National Biodiversity Network, so that other people have access to this data and the information, and any local record centre can make a request for this data as well. So it feeds into a lot of management plans that focus on reptiles and amphibians. And we really need your guys' help to submit your sightings of reptiles so that this project and other projects like this can identify areas where reptiles are doing well or perhaps aren't doing so well. And we can focus our research and we can focus our habitat management with far more precision than we would otherwise be able to. So this is a sort of request. If you enjoyed what you've learned today, if you want to begin a survey, whether that's just visual survey or whether you have the means to do a survey with Reptile Refugio, please do use the Dragon Finder app to record the number and the species of the reptile that you see. And you only really need to do 2 or 4 daylight surveys between April and July to get a good idea of whether there are reptiles on that site and get that data sent off to us, and we can start making better decisions for the future of reptiles. And hopefully this workshop has equipped you with the knowledge to be able to do this. Hopefully you feel confident enough to go out there and identify what reptiles you've seen.
Thank you.
before we begin the last few minutes, I just want to shout out to the National Lottery Heritage Fund, our funders. Thank you ever so much. I love working on this project. I'm not able to do it without the funding of these guys. So big thank you to them. If you do play the National Lottery, thank you as well. That helps us, well, that helps them fund projects like this. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to officially encourage everyone to gamble, but keep playing the lottery. It's great that you do so. Thank you. Anyway, here we go. So number 1, bad grass snake. I mean, I would accept grass snake in this country. But if you've got bad grass snake or grass snake, that's what it is. Key identifying feature, that yellow collar behind the back of the head there. Maybe some of you got this first time round. Hopefully most of you got it the second time round. Secondly, we've got the sand lizard, male sand lizard. So these bright green flanks, you've got that row of eye spots there, row of sort of eye spots on the back. Gives it away as a sand lizard. And it's on a beach. I mean, where else are you going to find a sand lizard? Third, common lizard. Very light, almost yellow looking common lizard, but you can see that vertebral line. Bit of a naff image, if I'm honest. It's a bit grainy. It's not a war lizard. You can see it's got quite a short tail in comparison to its body. Definitely a common lizard. Number 4, slow worm. I wasn't after the sex for this, but if you put male, slow worm, bonus points, I guess. We've got a slow worm here, that smooth, glossy skin. And hopefully if people go out looking for these and they're in more urban areas, this is the one you find. I like them. I think they're really cool looking. They've got nice little smiles. This is a smooth snake. I mean, you may have confused this with Asclepian snake, but this is a more brown colour, whereas Asclepian snake is more green. And this does have the eye stripe. Smooth snakes almost always have the eye stripe, whereas Asclepian snakes don't. You can't see the heart-shaped crest on this one. You can just about see 2 rows of spots running down its body, just about, but they're very faint. Definitely a boring looking. Of all our 3 native snakes, he's the most boring looking, but our rarest. So smooth snake for number 5. Number 6, green lizard. And in fact, I found that anybody that doesn't have prior knowledge of reptiles, if they're just making guesses, this is the one they get right most often, because it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's green, and it's a lizard. Green lizard. You could tell it's just this bright green all the way out, all the way throughout. I've never seen one of these actually. I would love to see one of these. I think it'd be pretty cool. Wall lizard, leggy, limby lizard, long legs, long neck, long face, long toes, long tail. It just looks different to the common lizard. It looks lighter in colour. Well, its markings do. And here we have the Asclepian snake. You can see it's less brown than the smooth snake. This one doesn't have an eye stripe like the other one I showed. Most of them don't, I think. You can't really see the stippling down the body, either because it doesn't have it or because of that sheen, that glistening sunshine that's shining off its body. But more lighter coloured than the smooth snake. Number 9, we have the adder. Hopefully you saw that zigzag pattern. That's what I'm trying to drill into everybody. It's got this zigzag pattern, but you can tell from the eye as well. It's got that vertical pupil. You can just about see the red iris as well. And then finally the red-eared terrapin. That red mark behind the ear giving it away is the red-eared terrapin and not the European pond turtle. Okay. So thank you everybody for attending the workshop. Really appreciate it. I hope you've at least found it enjoyable. Hopefully you've learned something as well.